Welcome to the Psych Ward Podcast, where we have conversations with everyday people about men. We believe that every man has an authentic version of himself. So, we're on a mission, and that mission is to find an answer to one question. What does it mean to be a man? Welcome back to the Psych Ward Podcast, where we have real conversations about men with men. I'm Eric Ward, and with me is my co-host, Mike Lucas. Mike is probably expecting me to insult him like I usually do. I'm not going to, though, and instead, he can work out with his therapist while he continually accepts being verbally abused by others. Mr. Lucas, how the heck are you?
Hey, I'm already on that, so don't worry about that. I got that covered.
Has my name come up in your therapy?
No. Only when I talk about Psych Ward.
All right, fine.
Yeah.
If it does, let me know. I'll change my behavior. We have a somewhat unusual topic for this episode, not as unusual as when we talked with a self-proclaimed junkie hooker, but close. We're going instead to talk about homelessness. And as I'm saying this out loud, it occurs to me that there's probably some overlap between those two topics. Anyway, some statistics. According to HUD's latest point-in-time survey, right around 700,000 people in the U.S. experience homelessness. It's almost 15% higher than 2 years ago. Of those 700,000, about 150,000 are defined as chronically homeless. In other words, they've been homeless for more than 12 months or had 3 episodes of homelessness in the last 3 years. That 700,000 figure also works out to about 20 people per 10,000 in the country. If you take a look at the states, Mississippi had the lowest rate of homelessness at 3.3 people per 10,000, while Washington, D.C. had the highest rate at 72.5% per 10,000. New York's number 2 at 52, and I will keep my political commentary to myself. Looking at individual cities, the top 2 for homelessness are New York and L.A. The point-in-time survey also found that there were 57,000 families who were homeless in the U.S. Each of those families had at least one child under the age of 18 who was currently experiencing homelessness. Overall, about 115,000 homeless children in our rather wealthy country. Not surprisingly, Black Americans have the highest percentage of homelessness. They make up 14% of the population, but nearly 40% of the country is homeless. And I'm hoping we can get into a discussion today about why that is. And lastly, and most relevant to our conversation, over 70% of the country's homeless are men. Joining us for this discussion is Ryan Dowd. He's one of those hard-working guys with 2 jobs. He's currently the head honcho for homelesstraining.com, an organization that works with companies like McDonald's, Los Angeles Public Libraries, and multiple other entities to help their employees learn de-escalation techniques in venues that are frequented by the homeless. Ryan also serves as the division director of mission and strategy for Hesed House, which is the second largest homeless shelter in Illinois. Prior to all of this, Ryan was the executive director at Hesed House for more than 20 years. Ryan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We appreciate you taking the time to come talk about kind of an unusual topic for us.
Not for me. That's pretty much all I talk about.
Do you ever get tired of it?
No, I don't.
That's the right answer. Let's start with a softball question, maybe. What is it that makes so many men end up homeless more than women?
A lot of times who ends up homeless, there's a cultural dimension. And what I mean by that is if you end up on the street, it's not just that you don't have enough money yourself, because there's plenty of people that don't have enough money on their own to support themselves, but they've got family, they've got friends, they've got support systems that can come in. And culturally, there's just much more of an expectation that men will stand on their own 2 feet, whereas women tend to elicit a little more sympathy. And so family in particular, and probably friends to a lesser degree, seem far more willing to step in and help a woman back on her feet than a man.
Why do you think that is? Do we just feel sorry for them and feel like we need to protect them?
I mean, isn't this what your whole podcast is about?
Why do men act like men?
Is it appropriate? Is it right? Is it, it is what it is. There's, homelessness is the sum total of all the choices that we make as a culture and politically and policy wise. And this is just one of those dimensions.
It's interesting. I don't know that I've ever had anyone in my family or friend circles that ended up homeless until right now. I have a family member who, as you just said, has kind of achieved the culmination of many, many years of bad choices. And I won't bore you with the details of what those bad choices are, but they're mostly bad financial choices, bad work choices. And that person is now sleeping in their car. Because there aren't a lot of options. I'm not willing to be an option because I've kind of drawn the line. But I'm wondering if I would feel any different if it were a female family member, actually, as I'm saying this out loud. Ryan, you can probably relate to this. I many years ago, when I was still doing mobile psychiatric crisis work, I was leaving the emergency room at like 1 or 2 in the morning, and there's that area of town where those kind of single room occupancy hotels are. And I was driving past there, and there was a young woman standing on the corner, and she looked terrified. And my initial gut response was to turn around and go back and pick her up. And I thought she was homeless, and she's young. She looked like she was 18 or 19 years old. And I was going to actually pick her up and drive her to your shelter, of all places. And then my common sense kicked in, and I realized that she, speaking of crossover between topics, probably was not just a homeless girl who happened to be standing on a corner next to a cheap hotel. She probably was engaged in other activity, and had I tried to interfere in her job duties, there was probably someone waiting in the background who would have tried to do me harm. And so I didn't do that. But again, it's that male want to step in and rescue. And here's this girl who the first thought was she's homeless and she needs to be saved and rescued and taken somewhere safe. But never once have I been driving around town and seen a guy sitting on the corner and think I should pick him up and drive him to the shelter at 2:00 in the morning. Like, I know I'm not an idiot. I'm not going to stop at 2:00 in the morning and talk to a guy I don't know. Ryan, did I ever tell you the story about when I got kicked out of a Jewel Osco grocery store?
No, please do.
Mike, have we talked about this on the podcast before? I don't remember.
I don't remember. I've heard the story, so I don't remember.
It was middle of winter, 5 degrees outside. I was running into Jewel to grab something. There was a young guy wearing nothing but a long sleeve dress shirt that was very dirty. He had no coat, standing outside asking people for money. So I stopped and I said, listen, I'm not going to give you any money, but I'm willing to help you. Tell me your story. What's going on with you? And he told me his story, and it sounded legitimate. Didn't sound like the usual, like, hey, I'm a homeless addict story. Maybe he was just really good. I don't know. So I told him, like, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to help you get in somewhere tonight. I actually referred him to one of your former staff for some help the following day, which was a Monday. I also gave him my coat because it was far too big for him because he was not anywhere near my size. But whatever, he needs a coat. His truck was out of gas. I told him, as soon as, let me go grab a few things. We'll go fill your truck up with gas. You can get where you need to go. I walked in the store. The manager came running up to me and like, why are you helping this guy? They're just like stray cats. If you feed them, they'll just keep coming back, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, the guy needed help. I was able to help. I'm going to help. And he told me to get out of his store. So whatever. It was an unusual response.
He was mad at you?
He was mad at me for...
Get out of his store? Jeez.
Yeah, because the irony was there was a woman who I guess was standing there watching, and she was with 2 of her children, and she walked up to me and she said, I just want to thank you because I always talk to my children about not just dismissing people and instead hearing their story. And you did exactly what we've been telling them to do. And they're going to learn more from that than anything we can say to them. But yeah, I got temporarily banned from the grocery store.
How dare you?
I know. It's my one time trying to actually materially help a homeless person and see what happened. This is why I don't do it, Ryan.
My experience with the homeless was through a place I used to work. And we used to go down to Hesed House. It was me and a coworker. And we would meet with all the people during the daytime pads. Yeah. So we would meet with people that they thought the staff thought needed maybe some mental health or addiction help. we had this van. Do you remember the blue van, Eric?
I do.
So we would take the blue van, do our Hesed House thing, and then we would go out and drive around and look for clients that were ours and just see how they were doing. We would oftentimes either get labeled as police, undercover police, or there were times when hookers tried to pick us up. So we would pull up to the park there, and then suddenly there'd be one or two females kind of like looking at the van and then smiling at us. And, we thought, well, we're on the clock. We can't be messing around with the females.
You would have if you weren't on the clock?
No.
Okay.
That was supposed to be a joke. Anyway, but that was actually one of my favorite jobs, going down there, offering assistance, offering help. We had a program through HUD at the time where we could give them first month's rent and deposit. And what I learned after about a year of this was most of that money went to drugs somehow, some way. And I was kind of upset about that. I thought, man, look at this. I'm helping all these people get apartments. And then inevitably we would hear they relapsed. They spent all their money on drugs. And that was really a bummer for me.
And so, Ryan, I think along those same lines as what Mike is saying, I want to direct this back to you because prior to Mike doing it, I did that exact same job. I went with a coworker. We went down to the homeless shelter. We met with people who the staff there thought maybe could use mental health treatment. We tried to develop a relationship with them and eventually engage them in care. And we were often very successful and often got them out of the homeless shelter into treatment and into housing of one form or another. And I guess I'll qualify this by saying we were in the overnight shelter. The PADS program was an overnight shelter. People would come in at 7 p.m. They had to be out at 7 a.m. These were not people who were actively working with all the other ancillary supports that the shelter offered to get a job, save money, get all the different forms of medical and mental health and substance abuse treatment that they needed. But I'm standing in the shelter, and Ryan, I'm looking around at this room full of people, and I saw the same people month after month, year after year, same thing, no change, right? And to me, it looked like the pattern was kind of like Mike is describing, that, they're there for 3 hots and a cot and waiting for their government check to come in at the beginning of the month. Once they got it, they went and blew it on alcohol and drugs, and then the cycle begins all over again. So I guess my question for you, Ryan, is tell me what I'm missing.
Yeah, so, I can see how it would look that simple, and I don't mean to be derogatory towards you.
No.
Maybe I do a little bit, but not so much.
I can handle it.
Yeah, so let's start by kind of backing up. There's actually different types of homelessness. So the most common duration of homelessness in our country is actually a single night. So most people are actually not homeless for very long. At Hesed House, last time I ran stats, about half the people we would serve would be with us for less than 2 weeks. This population typically had no serious issues. There was no mental health issues. There's no substance use issues. They typically had some sort of economic crisis. They could handle one person losing a job, but not two. They land on the street, scares the living heck out of them. They work their butts off. They get back on their feet again, and they never tell another soul that they were homeless for that less than 2 week period. Then the second group is more than 2 weeks, but less than a year, and it was about 40% of Hesed House. And these folks typically had one major life barrier. So there was a mental health issue, or a substance use issue, or a medical issue, or their job sector disappeared because it got outsourced or whatever. And these folks, because they only had one issue, you could work with them to resolve that one issue enough that they could get back on their feet again within a year. And so if you put the first two types together, you get 90% of the people we served at Hesed House. The last 10% was a year or longer. And this is, as you pointed out earlier, this is what the federal government terms chronic homelessness, where it's a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. We have a gentleman at the shelter who moved into Hesed House at some point during the Reagan administration. We don't know which year of the Reagan administration because he doesn't remember and our records don't go back that far. Definitely chronically homeless. The chronically homeless population is cognitively different than the general population by dramatic margins. So I'm going to see if I can do this off the top of my head. 18% schizophrenia, 19% bipolar disorder, 50% PTSD, 53% traumatic brain injury, 70, I think it's 8% substance use disorder, and like something like 92% personality disorder. What that means is, and if you add those up, you obviously realize it doesn't add up to 100. Meaning you got people with PTSD and traumatic brain injury and bipolar disorder, or pick three out of the six. And think about how our labor market's changed. In the year 1900, something like 70% of people worked in farming, manufacturing, or construction. Now, 80% of people work in their professional services, service sector, or IT. Disability 120 years ago was an amputation. Disability today is all cognitive. If you have traumatic brain injury and disinhibition that comes with it, you're not doing IT, most likely. You're definitely not doing anything that involves customer service, which is what all the low-end jobs are, because your disinhibition is going to cause you to say stuff that's inappropriate. And so our labor market has created this huge swath of quote-unquote able-bodied people who have no place in our labor market because the labor market has changed so much. And yet our conception of disability is still 1900s era. We still look at somebody on the street and go, well, he could get a job. I don't see anything wrong with him. Well, that was a perfectly appropriate analysis in 1900 and wildly inappropriate today. And so once you start drilling down on all those other stats, the TBI, the traumatic brain injury, the schizophrenia, the bipolar disorder, then how does that interact with substances? Well, do people occasionally try to self-medicate, their PTSD with other substances?
Never heard of it. Nope.
Never heard of it. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, think about it. Like, if somebody has a bad day at work, they lose a key account at work, and they're gonna lose that commission. Nobody thinks anything of them going home and having a drink because of it, and that's over a minor inconvenience. Yet someone who's struggling with hearing voices and traumatic brain injury and chronic pain and whatnot, if they turn to substances to help alleviate those symptoms, we judge them. And so, do drugs and alcohol play a role? Absolutely. Oftentimes, though, they are ancillary to another issue that by itself would have been a disabling condition. So the drugs are a sideshow. The alcohol is a sideshow. Take away the drugs and alcohol, the person's still cognitively disabled. And that's the challenge, that we as a society have chosen to look at the most obvious surface layer condition, inebriation, because you can't see traumatic brain injury. Because schizophrenia, if you're intoxicated, schizophrenia doesn't look a whole lot different than somebody who's not schizophrenic and intoxicated. And so we really miss what's happening below the surface, which is, I would argue, about 150,000 people in this country who are cognitively disabled, but we have not caught up with our conception of disability in this country.
So it sounds like back in 1900, the answer, the cure, for lack of a better term, to homelessness was jobs or institutionalization or some combination of the two.
So a lot has changed since the year 1900, surprisingly.
Right. And I guess that's my question is if that was the answer back in 1900, were they willing to participate in the answer? What's the answer now? And I know that is a loaded question.
I would say you address the three different types of homelessness I laid out completely differently. For the first type, the people that are homeless for 2 weeks or less, I would argue, and this might not be popular amongst my peers, we don't need to do anything different. If you're homeless for 2 weeks or less, that sucks. That really does suck. But it doesn't suck as bad as cancer. It doesn't suck as bad as getting in a really bad car accident. And so, poop happens. If you're homeless for 2 weeks or less, then it happened. The second group, I would argue, we keep doing what we're doing right now, and we just try to do a little more of it. And that's kind of a rehabilitation model. So the model everybody wants for homelessness is rehabilitation. Let's fix the person, put them back into paying taxes and whatnot. And for that second group, where they have one major issue, where they worked in an industry that doesn't exist anymore, well, then let's get them some job retraining. We had a gentleman. He was one of the best people in the country at chemically processing movie film. And he got paid very well to do the chemical processing of movie films. Well, guess what happened when everything switched to digital? There's no need for a guy that processes the film.
Right.
Needs massive job retraining to fit into a new job. But that's possible, or a major medical issue that has some sort of resolvability to it. Or a lower grade mental health issue that can be medicated and get the person back to some sort of stability. I wouldn't do a lot differently than we're doing now. But the third type, chronic homelessness, we need to accept that there is a segment of our country, about 150,000 people, that are cognitively disabled. And we can either accept that fact and do what you need to do with people who are unsupported and incapable of holding down a job. And that means giving them an apartment and giving them support wraparound services, a case manager, social workers. Or we can do it exactly what we're doing right now, which is far more expensive and far less pleasant for everybody involved. And that's just do nothing, let them live on the street. And there's two problems with that, as I kind of alluded to. One is I don't think that's not America that I don't think anybody wants to live in. It's homelessness is this weird thing where Republicans and Democrats tend to both agree that it sucks. And yet we still haven't done anything about it. There's no pro-homelessness lobby that's trying to maintain homelessness. We haven't fixed it because we don't know what to do, and we're not willing. And what we do know what to do, we're not willing to spend the money. But so the first reason to do this is because homelessness is increasingly damaging the fabric of our country. There's a real good chance that San Francisco will collapse under the weight of homelessness. I think we're watching that in real time. And Portland's probably next. And then little by little, it's going to spread across the West Coast and then go out from there, because that's how this tends to happen. Fast food companies now have added to their algorithms of where to place restaurants. They've added how close is it to a local homeless shelter, and they're just not going to place fast food restaurants, within I don't know what the exact stat is, within a mile, let's say, of a homeless shelter. We can homelessness is costing our country dearly right now. And ironically, since we're only talking about 150,000 people in a country of 350 million, we're not talking about that many people. And once we accept that they are disabled, they are incapable of working, even if you remove the substance use, all of a sudden the solution starts to look a little more palatable. And the second reason for that is it's just cheaper. Someone with a psychiatric disorder on the street costs society a fortune. They have a lot of run-ins with the police. They obviously consume shelter services. They spend a lot of time in ambulances and emergency rooms. They spend a lot of time in front of judges. They suck up jail time for stupid, petty offenses. And when you start adding that all up, it's tens of thousands of dollars a year. And the research on this is crystal clear. You take that exact same person, you plop them down into an affordable apartment, that affordable in this case defined as 100% subsidized, and you assign a social worker to visit them weekly. Everything gets better. They spend, I don't remember the exact stats off the top of my head, 80% less time in ERs. They spend 90% less time in ambulances. They spend 100% less time in jail, and on and on and on and on again. And once you start adding up those costs, it exceeds the cost of the apartment. The savings exceeds the cost of the apartment and the social worker. So ending homelessness for that segment of homelessness is cheaper than allowing it, and a heck of a lot better for the person and a heck of a lot better for everybody else. And so in my mind, it's the only thing holding us back at this point is we don't want to help people who do drugs or might do drugs.
Right. You mentioned three towns, San Francisco, Seattle, and Portland, all on the West Coast. And when I was getting ready for this particular episode, one of the things that I kept coming across was that across the country in general, homelessness is actually slightly declining in terms of homeless rates. but the West Coast is far and away making up for any slight declines elsewhere in the country, just with the increase in homeless numbers on the West Coast. Why do you think that is?
The math on this is crystal clear. It is related to property values and affordable housing inventory. So I forget the exact number off the top of my head, but affordability is defined as roughly a third of your income going towards rent or mortgage. As you start to increase above a third, your housing instability rises pretty sharply. And so if you simply look at what's the average or the median income for a region, and then what's the median housing price for a region, once the median housing price starts to go above one third the median income, you get a exponential growth in homelessness for every additional percentage point. And so, if average income is 3 times average rent, you have a pretty static level of homelessness. But if you go 34, 35, 36, 37, 38%, all of a sudden homelessness starts to go up exponentially. And the West Coast is just expensive. It's really expensive. So San Francisco is one of the most expensive places in the country. And that's the weird thing, is that if you look at homelessness and if you try to analyze homelessness based on who becomes homeless, you get a picture of it's poor people, shockingly. It's African Americans. It is people with mental health issues. It is people with substance use issues. That's kind of the picture. If you analyze homelessness, instead of asking who becomes homeless, but instead ask where do people become homeless, you get a completely different picture. So Detroit, which has one of the highest poverty rates in our country, has a dramatically lower homelessness rate than San Francisco, which is one of the highest income areas in our country. And that's not coincidental. It is 100% related. Detroit has relatively low homelessness because Detroit has affordable housing, a lot of it actually, versus San Francisco has virtually nothing. And so you end up with really high homelessness rates. Interestingly enough, in predominantly African-American communities, you usually don't actually have high homelessness rates. But in predominantly white areas, you oftentimes have higher homelessness rates, but it's the African-Americans who live there who are homeless. And so racism as it relates to homelessness it's not that the racism is impacting entire communities of African Americans. It's impacting African Americans who live in predominantly white areas.
Because they get priced out?
They get priced out. They get, racist, all sorts of racist systems within the real estate market will force them out. But oftentimes it's related to that. In terms of homelessness, you're better being a poor person in a poor area than a poor person in a rich area.
So when I was reading the information about the West Coast, one of the things that kept popping up was part of the rationale for it is that the West Coast does not have anywhere near the social service infrastructure that certainly the East Coast has, but even the Midwest. Does that sound accurate?
So there's another variable here that actually relates to that, believe it or not, which is weather. And people say, oh, well, look, LA, I'd rather be homeless in LA than in Alaska. Here's the flip side of that, though, is that warmer communities don't build homeless shelters.
Right.
Cold communities do. So New York, on a per capita basis, has way more homeless shelter beds than New York City. New York has way more than LA. And so while it can look like the weather is people are migrating to an area because of the weather, in fact, it's more like there's very little migration of homeless folks because migration is expensive. It's more that we don't build shelter beds when people don't freeze, unless people are going to freeze to death.
My daughter lives in Long Beach, which is close to LA, and we've gone to LA a few times and seen Skid Row. And I live in downtown Chicago, and the difference was shocking to me. Skid Row was hundreds and hundreds of people in tents. I don't see that here in Chicago. I do see tents, but they tend to be kind of like out in the outskirts. But downtown in the Loop, you don't see any tents. And
go to Lower Wacker.
Even lower whacker is not what it used to be.
Yeah. But it was just shocking to me. And then we went to San Francisco, and I was shocked even more because they have this part near the Tenderloin that is actually fenced off, and it's just full of tents. It's almost like a little tent city that's fenced off. Now, I have heard, and I noticed, Ryan, you didn't mention LA. I've heard that they're actually starting a housing project for the homeless in LA. I don't know whether or not that's working or if it's actually gone ahead, but what about LA? Do you know much? Is it improved there? Are they working on that?
No, it's not improved. So California has poured billions of dollars into homelessness, and the challenge is twofold. An economist once explained it this way. He goes, "We're throwing billions of dollars at $1 trillion problem, and then wondering why it didn't work." And part of that challenge is the way it's done is brutally expensive, and part of the problem is codes, is building codes. So, you need to earthquake proof it. You need to whatever all the other codes are. And if you end up, if it costs you $750,000 per efficiency apartment, $1 billion goes really quick. And you really didn't build that many units. And so we need to find cheaper ways to create affordable housing than the way we're doing it right now.
Yeah, and I think Chicago obviously has more shelters, so you don't see them on the street as much. I was just shocked at I had heard of Skid Row. I've seen Tent City when they had that at Hesed House, and I thought that was pretty shocking. But Skid Row was another level, and then San Francisco, even that blew my mind.
Ryan, I don't know how different I am from maybe the average person, and I think part of my question, we talk about men and men's issues on this podcast. Are men more or less generous to the homeless? And let me tell you why I'm asking. I've bought meals for homeless people. I've, like I said, given them my coat. I've offered to help find a job, find housing, find temporary shelter. But never once in my life have I handed money to a homeless person. So my first question is, am I a jerk? And second, am I different from most men?
So are you a jerk for not giving money, or is that just an open-ended question?
Either one. I can handle getting my feelings hurt.
So I get asked all the time, should I give people money or should I not? And here's what I tell everybody. I'm not going to judge you either way. If you give, that's your personal decision. If you don't give, that's your personal decision. I don't judge you either way. I do not give cash to people panhandling on the street. Why? There's actually a lot of free food in this country, a lot of free food. And so I'm not saying that the money is always going to go towards drugs or alcohol, but it's probably not going to food. I will walk somebody into a McDonald's, buy them a meal. I'll, if I'm carrying leftovers and the person's interested in lukewarm fettuccine, then, I'll go take that direction. But I don't give cash. Again, but I don't judge people who do. That's a personal decision. So in that regard, no, you're not a jerk.
We gave money yesterday to a guy. He was juggling on in the intersection there at the red light, and I figured, we'll pay him for his talent.
I know how to juggle. You give me money?
Yeah, I've just never seen you do it.
All right, cool.
But every time I go out, I'm accosted at least 2-3 times, and if I gave money every time I went out, that gets expensive. So I've kind of learned to ignore it, but I feel terrible doing that.
So here's what I do.
Yeah.
I won't give money, and my answer is always the same, which is I'm sorry I don't carry cash, which is true. Credit cards have made it a lot easier to gracefully say no.
That's true for me too.
But what I always do is I'll acknowledge their humanity. So it's I'm sorry I don't carry cash, but if I'm late for a meeting, I'm like, I'm sorry I don't carry cash, but you have a fantastic day. Or if I actually do have a minute or two to spare, like I'm sorry I don't carry cash, but how's your day going? And a little bit of eye contact and a little bit of pleasant tone of voice goes a real long way. One of the things I've learned from people is when you're panhandling, you get treated like garbage. The best case scenario is that people pretend you don't exist, and you become invisible. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is you get absolutely berated by people, screaming at you to get a job and whatnot. And so it's incredibly dehumanizing to ask for money. And so, in my opinion, I could give you $5, but I genuinely believe that a warm smile and a you have a good day is more important than the $5 for the person's humanity.
Yeah, that's a good point.
You talk about how they're treated. When I used to do mobile crisis work, I spent a lot of time interacting with law enforcement, and let's just call it a town north of your homeless shelter, just north. The officers, I remember a couple of different times they were laughing and joking about when they called it the homeless people wander up the river to their town and would sit on the other side of the river or sit under the viaducts. And these police officers, as a group, would go get fireworks and shoot them over the river at the homeless people. And they called it chasing them back home, where they belonged. And they thought it was the funniest thing in the world. And I'm pretty confident that doesn't still happen for that particular police department. Maybe sort of confident. But I remember at the time just looking at them, and of course, I wasn't going to get into it with a bunch of cops who were going to be pulling out of the same parking lot that I was, but just looking at them you are despicable human beings, no matter what you think of these homeless individuals, no matter why you think they're homeless. Really? Fireworks? You're going to shoot explosives at them? But to them, it was just great fun. It was humor. It was their idea of, a nice break in the middle of their shift.
You want me to tell you the most depressing thing I'm going to tell you all day?
Sure. Mike's a good therapist. I'll talk to him when we're done.
There you go. So they did a study. They put a bunch of people in an fMRI machine, and they showed them various pictures just to see what part of the brain would light up. And if I show you a picture of your neighbor or your friend or Brad Pitt or some banker looking dude, a specific part of your brain lights up, and that part of the brain is the part of the brain that recognizes a human being. So if you see a cheetah or an elephant, a different part of the brain lights up, but when you see a human being, this part of the brain lights up. If you show those same people a picture of someone who looks homeless, someone who kind of fits the stereotype of homelessness, that part of the brain doesn't light up. So the part of the brain that sees a human being literally does not function when they see someone who's chronically homeless. A different part of the brain does. And unfortunately, it's the same part of the brain that lights up if you show them a picture of vomit, an overflowing toilet, or anything else that is disgusting. And so for a large percentage of humanity, they literally don't see a human being. I mean, this is the literal definition of dehumanization. Their brain does not acknowledge a human being is there. Their brain views them as synonymous to an overflowing toilet or vomit. And so it's not shocking that people would treat homeless folks in very vile ways because they literally do not recognize their humanity.
Ooh, that's awful. So for myself, I notice when I see somebody laying in the street, I almost go into a protective mode so that I don't feel anything when I walk by them, which is probably not the best way to handle it. But I wonder if part of that is same thing. If you see vomit, you sort of just kind of turn away. For me, when I pass a homeless person, I feel so much empathy and some days I don't feel like feeling that empathy. So I just shut down and I pretend that I don't see it. I wonder if some of that could be partly related to shutting down.
I suspect, though, the part of you, because you've done this work, you see that you've literally experienced the humanity on the other side of the stereotype.
Yeah.
I suspect that's actually not at all related. I suspect that the part of your brain that's that sees disgust is not going to light up when you see a homeless person. Quite the opposite. That their humanity is and their suffering is so painful for you.
Yeah.
That you at some level turn that off. That strikes me as dramatically different. In fact, polar opposite.
Okay. Well, then there are people that just don't see them as human.
Yeah. And they shoot firecrackers at them.
Yeah, that's true.
Or BB guns, or every year or so, somebody wakes up to gasoline being dumped on them. Horrible things happen.
Well, that happened here. They set a guy on fire.
Yeah.
They called him the walking man. And I would see him all the time. He was sleeping and I think it was on Lower Wacker, just set him on fire. He lived, but he died recently. I don't know if it was related to that, but yeah, awful.
Mike, going full circle, that reaction that you are trying to avoid, is it the same reaction when you see homeless men as homeless women?
Yeah, I think it's the same. I see a lot more homeless men than women. But yeah, I would say it's the same. And some days I do what Ryan said. I make eye contact. I say hello. I feel like I can handle it. There's other days where I'm not feeling that confident and I'm feeling whatever I'm feeling. And I will sort of just shut down so that I don't have to think about how awful this is. Like yesterday, there was a guy laying on the street, no shirt, shouting at somebody on the corner that wasn't there. And I had to do that. I had to just kind of like just shut myself down and not think about what was just happening. Because I see it every day. And so I think if I only saw it once a year, it'd be a different reaction. But I just have to do that for my own protection sometimes.
That's interesting. I don't get that. I don't have that feeling. And I think mine's just the opposite. After you've seen 300 people a day, every day for 20 years, mine becomes much more calculated. Realistically speaking, can I help? If not, there's no point feeling guilty. Keep on walking. If there's something I can do, like say good morning, say hello, whatever, do it. Move on with your day. But I think I'm probably not numb or calloused to the need, but my brain tends to more go towards, if I can help, do it. If not, there's no point dwelling on it.
Ryan, the community that I live in is probably wealthier than average. I live in the poor part. Let's just get that clear. But it's a wealthier community. And I would say over the last 2 to 3 years, there has been, first of all, this is one of those communities that never, ever allowed panhandling. They would take them to jail. There's one notable exception. Like, this is still one of those communities that has the homeless, what people refer to as crazy man that everybody knows about. Everybody knows his name. Everybody knows his story. He lives in a tent on the side of the road. It's actually multiple tents by now. There's, he has odd political signs and layers of stuff. And he's out there all year round. Doesn't matter if it's 10 below zero. Doesn't matter if it's 101. That guy set aside. Not only are we over the last few years seeing panhandling, but it looks very, very different from the community that I work in and where Hesed House is. I think in that community, it's still primarily male panhandling. But what we're seeing here is almost exclusively one of two things: either young women, often pregnant young women. They are almost always some sort of minority, typically Latino or Middle Eastern, which is different. Or we're seeing families of those same demographics, with the children sitting on the side of the road or even standing on the corner with the parents asking for money. When I see the women standing by themselves, or there'll be a group of 2 or 3 of them at an intersection, the first thing that comes to my mind is they're being trafficked. And maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. Seeing more and more Latino young women, I'm wondering if this is just this sort of unchecked, let's call it immigration that we've been experiencing the last few years. But it's a change. Is our community different, or is this kind of being reflected elsewhere?
I'll be honest, I don't know the answer to that. Panhandling and homelessness is obviously are related, but they're certainly not identical. And I know the kind of socio-demographic trends behind homelessness much more than I know them for panhandling writ large.
And they all have signs saying that they're homeless, whether that's accurate or not. Who knows? I mean, maybe they're one of these people you hear about on the news where they, wrap up for the day and go get an Lexus and drive to their townhome. I don't know.
Yeah, there's not nearly enough money in panhandling.
Right. It doesn't feel that way.
I've asked people. You tend to make between $40 and $60 a day.
Yeah, that's not going to pay any bills.
Less than minimum wage. Yeah.
Is that just a made up story that, the person drives a BMW and they just come down? I mean, I'm thinking if I drove a BMW, why would I want to go panhandle? I mean, it doesn't make sense to me, and I've never seen that happen, but it's definitely a story I hear a lot.
It's a really catchy story, though, right?
Yeah.
Its truth was not really relevant.
Yeah.
Oh, it certainly tweaks my overdeveloped sense of justice. That's not fair. They shouldn't be allowed to get away with that, right? So it's achieving the purpose that whoever created the story wanted.
Yeah.
So, but let's talk about panhandling for just a second, though. There is one aspect of panhandling that I, let's say, appreciate, and that's that. For many people, I talked earlier about cognitive disability. For many people, it's not that they're never capable of working. It's that the cognitive issue, the schizophrenia, the voices, the manic from the bipolar, whatever, when it happens, they're not going to be able to work that day. Or if they do show up at work, they're going to get fired. And other than Uber, which requires, that you have a car and a relatively new one, or day labor, which, that's a whole other issue. There's not a lot of jobs where you can opt out on the days where your mental health is bad. You have to show up every day that you're scheduled, or you're not going to keep the job. But panhandling, on days where the voices are just too strong for you to be around other people, you can opt out, and then you pick back up when the voices calm down. And so it is, I put it in air quotes, but it's a job, so to speak, that allows you to do it when you're capable, but not when you're not. And our labor market used to have more of those, that kind of stereotypical show up at the docks, raise your hand, and they pick 25 guys to go load crates. Those jobs don't exist anymore, though.
Yeah, the only place you see it is outside, hardware stores or big box stores where you've got day laborers just hanging around waiting to work for cash. But that's the uncommon exception.
Are there people who prefer, and this sounds weird, but prefer the homeless lifestyle?
The myth of the people who choose it. What do we do about the people who choose to be homeless?
Yeah.
So I would argue, and I think I'm pretty right, there is not a single person who, quote unquote, chose homelessness once you factor in the cognitive disability. So if I have schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and traumatic brain injury, and I, A, can't maintain a job, B, struggle to be around other people because of the conflict that's created, and I choose to go live in the woods by myself, did I choose homelessness? Or were my cognitive issues so disabling that I want to the one place where I could function without getting arrested constantly? Again, once you start looking at the cognitive disabling conditions related to chronic homelessness, everything looks different.
Yeah.
So homelessness is the worst of 10 evils, or maybe the best of 10 evils.
I was probably the best. Yeah, like the least bad option.
Yeah.
So like, what do you like? We had a woman stay with us where she was gay. When she came out to her parents, they kicked her out of the house. She went from crack house to crack house because they would accept her until finally, I think after the second time she got raped, she came to Hesed House. When you don't have options, sometimes the options you have, you got to take the options that are available to you, and sometimes they're pretty lousy. And so, again, if you're struggling with schizoaffective disorder and traumatic brain injury, you're not getting a job, you're not staying in any ordinary apartment, and you may not even be able to function in a homeless shelter.
All of these potential solutions to homelessness that we've talked about, the thing that stands out to me the most is that none of them are fast. I think about a client that we had at my last organization who we met at your shelter. And I don't know if you were there at the time, but he was a guy who, he was a kid. His parents moved while he was away at school for the day, came home, lived under the porch, yada, yada, yada. That was the whole story. Whether it was true or not, who knows? But he had developed pretty severe mental illness, and had either lost or given up, or some combination of the two, most of his verbal skills initially. I remember the first time we met him when we were down there doing outreach, trying to engage people in services. He wouldn't even come into the office to talk to us. He just stared at us, didn't say a word, and eventually just turned around and walked away. And the next week we were there and we talked to him again, and he stared at us and turned around and walked away. Week after week after week. And if I remember right, it took somewhere around 2 years to even get him to come walk into the office and let us do our pitch. After probably 4 years, we had moved him into a residential program that was specifically for mentally ill people. But it was 4 years of constant and intentional effort on our part to just engage the guy in a conversation, and then a conversation about getting well and what that looked like and what was out there for him. And he did very well in that treatment program, very well. Never worked. He wasn't going to work. It wasn't possible that he was going to work. But he got the care that he needed. He was functional. He lived in the community. He was free to come and go to the store, do his own grocery shopping with some assistance. Sometimes, he could walk across the street to the fast food place, and he did regularly. It showed in his physique, but he was living in some ways the life that a lot of people in the community live. But it took 4 years.
Yeah, that's going to be predominantly PTSD. And obviously a severe case of PTSD where he's been so utterly abused by others that he's nonverbal. There's something you need to know about homelessness. So if you take 10,000 men, so here's your manly stats. Take 10,000 men of the general population. How many of them do you think are were sexually assaulted in any year out of 10,000 men?
I would say less than 10%.
It's 3, not 3%, 3. 3 out of 10,000 men.
Oh, 3 people?
3 people out of 10,000. 3 men, most men, there is very, very little violence. For women, it's much higher, but it's 3. What about homeless men? What do you think it is? How many out of 10,000 for homeless men? So if it's 3 for non-homeless, what do you think it is for homeless out of every 10,000?
200.
2,710.
Wow.
Oh.
It's 900 times higher. If you become homeless, the odds of violence against you go up 900-fold. Not 900%, times 900. What's that? Like 900,000% or whatever that would be.
Wow.
It's the rate of violence against homeless folks is astronomically high.
Yeah, I was surprised you said 50% were PTSD.
Yeah, 50% PTSD.
I would have never guessed that.
Well, something like 2/3 of them also were victims of child abuse as well, prior to becoming homeless. So
yeah,
some of that's going to be from the child abuse. Some of that's going to be from this ridiculously high rates of violence.
First time I set foot in a homeless shelter, Hesed House, I thought homeless shelters were full of unfortunate people who lost their job and they would get back on their feet. And I know that that's a big part of it. But what I saw was the 10% you talked about who were chronically homeless. And I thought the homeless shelter is not a safe place to go if I ever became homeless.
Well, so some of that's just math, right? So if 50% of the people are homeless for 2 weeks or less, and the most common duration is 1 night. If you happen to show up on February 22nd, what percentage of those people who are homeless for only a few nights are likely to be there on that specific date? Not many, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because most people aren't homeless. So, meaning you could volunteer on January 1st and then again on February 1st, and in between that, those 2 dates of volunteering, 50 people might have come and gone.
Yeah.
They were there for a night or 2, and you just never saw them. Who did you see? The people that were there on January 1st and February 1st, and March 1st and April 1st, the chronically homeless. And so most shelter staff are shocked to hear that statistic because it doesn't feel right. Because when you look around the room, who you're seeing is primarily chronically homeless people, because that's who's homeless 365 nights of any year.
Right. And that's who I was there to see for my job. So that makes sense. Yeah.
So Ryan, we always wrap up by asking every guest the same question. What does it mean to be a real man?
I think you'd have to ask my wife.
She's a real man?
That's my wife saying I have absolutely no idea.
Give it your best shot.
So I'll be honest, like, and I think I told you this when you asked me to do it. Like, I actually don't think about that a lot. I like masculinity or manliness or it's not a big part of my identity. It's just not something I give a lot of thought to. And it's not a rejection per se of the male identity. It's more of an indifference.
It's so interesting because, Mike, you said almost those exact same words, I think, in our first podcast, that it was just not something that you had thought about until I asked you to work with me on this project.
Yeah.
Whereas as I was actually talking, I was in Michigan actually until just a couple of hours ago, and was talking with my wife's aunt, and she's actually trying to put together through her parish a program for men. And we were talking about some of the struggles that men have, and, kind of how the job, so to speak, of a man has changed over time. And I told her, I said, I always come back to the 3 Ps, right? When I talk about what it means to be male and what my job is. And those 3 are always provide, protect, and prepare. And I told her, I think it's one of the reasons that men in particular sometimes struggle when their children become adults and move out on their own, because that prepare piece is kind of done. And we lose a third of our role identity. And it's why some men struggle sometimes. I think it's why some men struggle to have wives who work, or even, my goodness, make more than they do, right? Because the challenge is that provide piece. That being said, I don't know that I'm full score conventional male, but I think, in comparison to the 2 of you, probably a little bit more toward that side of the spectrum. And it certainly for me is something that I think, well, what's my role? What's my job? What's my place? And I also think that, and this is a whole different set of discussions, not just one, but, having grown up in kind of traditional churches, and there's certainly some emphasis on male-female roles in religious institutions too. But anyway.
Yeah. And, I said that when we started the podcast, but since we've started it, I've thought about it a lot. And I do hold some very, like the story I gave earlier, some very strong feelings about what a man does. One is drive. I mean, it seems simple, but that kind of fits in with the provide transportation, protect. What was the third P? Prepare.
Yeah.
So I do notice things more now, like when I do the dishes, that I think while I'm doing them, this really isn't very manly. So I've been thinking about that more.
We have a family member who we were talking about on the way home. We're going to end up having to go to her house to help with a manual labor task, simply because her boyfriend didn't find it worth his time and effort. And
that's not very manly,
right? And that's my initial response is kind of like that's your girlfriend. Like, she needs help with something. You need to take care of that. It's something that you can do. You're bigger, you're stronger, you're whatever. Just get it done. Like, what's your problem? But I understand that not everybody thinks the way that I do.
On the other hand, I tried to move a couch with my wife Thursday, and I felt very emasculated when I really was struggling with it. I felt, and then the guy that came in to actually help us,
he took the heavy end.
It with no problem. That really hurt. he was like, wow, he manhandled that thing.
Michael, what is your takeaway?
Ryan, it was so good to talk to you. Like I said, I've read about you, heard about you, and admired you from afar.
His ego is big enough. You don't need to.
No, I've always enjoyed my time when I was spending time down at Hesed House, and I thought that place did a really good job with homeless people and being a referral source for us. And a couple things that struck me were the PTSD was I would have never, I don't know why I never thought of that. I would have put schizophrenia at the top. What percentage was it?
18%, but that is compared to like 0.7% of the general population. So, for perspective.
Okay, yeah, there's not as many. Yeah, so sometimes you think, oh, they all have schizophrenia. It's just what you see. Homelessness is so complicated. There's so many myths out there. Even for somebody like me who spent a lot of time working with them, I still have some of those myths. Like, I think some people prefer it, and I'm never quite sure if that's quite the right answer. And thank you for clearing that up. I've come away thinking, well, it's their only option, given their disabilities and cognitive issues. It's just their only option, and they learn to deal with it the best they can. So thank you for clearing that up.
I do find it interesting that you just said disabilities and cognitive issues.
I know.
Meaning you just did exactly what I was talking about. You separated physical disabilities from cognitive issues. And I would argue that the new disabilities are all cognitive.
Great point. I'm going to leave that in too, so we can hammer that point home.
Thank you.
I won't edit myself. I just noticed I'm wearing my Give a Shirt and Vote. Give a Shirt is what's it called? It's a magazine that the homeless people sell here. Streetwise. So when you buy a shirt from Give a Shirt, money gets donated to Streetwise. So
cool.
That was a happy accident.
Ryan, it's been a pleasure. Thank you. It's great to catch up with you. It's been a long time. And as always, your expertise in this particular area is unrivaled and just a pleasure to hear.
You're not going to give me your takeaway?
I don't have one, man. I'm not actually as smart as my wife thinks I am. So, we rely heavily on Mike for that.
It's a lot of pressure.